The morning after a typhoon always arrives the same way. There is no dramatic announcement, no gradual lightening of the sky that signals relief. The wind simply stops. Not slowly, not gently. It stops the way a door slams shut, leaving behind a silence so complete and so foreign that people who have been awake all night inside concrete shelters and reinforced rooms find themselves confused by it. For a few seconds, maybe longer, they do not move. They sit in the dark, and they listen to the silence, and they try to understand what it means. Then someone opens a door, and they see what Sinlaku left behind. On the island of Guam on the morning of April 15th, 2026, that door opened onto a landscape that had been restructured overnight. Roads that existed 12 hours earlier were gone, not flooded, not blocked by fallen trees, but physically erased under meters of debris and sediment and the kind of soil displacement that happens when water moves through a place at speeds no engineer ever designed for. Power lines that had served communities since the 1980s lay twisted across what used to be yards and parking lots and the edges of what used to be highways. The trees that were still standing, and there were not many, had been stripped of everything. No leaves, no small branches, just trunks and the largest limbs pointing in the same direction. All of them bent slightly east, all of them telling you exactly which direction the wind had come from. Buildings that had been constructed after previous typhoons, buildings that were supposed to be better, stronger, more resilient than anything that came before them, had lost roofs or walls, or in some cases had simply collapsed inward on themselves. The way a paper cup collapses when you squeeze it from the sides. This is what a category for typhoon does to a place. This is what Sinlaku did. And the people who study these storms, the scientists at the National Weather Service and the Joint Typhoon Warning Center and the atmospheric research centers that had been tracking Sinlaku for nearly 2 weeks before it made landfall, had been warning that this moment was coming. They had said the words clearly and in plain language and through every channel available to them. They had issued watches, and then warnings, and then escalating conditions of readiness that moved the islands of Guam and the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands through a checklist of preparation that was designed over decades of experience with Western Pacific typhoons to give people the best possible chance of surviving what was coming. Many people did survive. The vast majority of people did. But surviving a storm and surviving its aftermath are two different problems. And on the morning of April 15th, the people of Guam were only beginning to understand the second one. The path that Sinlaku took to reach Guam was not a surprise. Tropical cyclone forecasting has become, over the past several decades, one of the genuine success stories of atmospheric science. The track models that meteorologists use to project where a storm is going have improved so dramatically since the late 20th century that what would have been a catastrophic failure of warning in 1980 is now routine guidance. The Joint Typhoon Warning Center, which is operated by the United States Navy and Air Force, and which is responsible for monitoring tropical cyclone activity across the Pacific and Indian Oceans, had been tracking Sinlaku since it was a disorganized cluster of thunderstorms near the Federated States of Micronesia 11 days before landfall. The system organized slowly at first, then with increasing speed, feeding on water temperatures that were running nearly 2 degrees Celsius above the long-term average for that part of the Pacific in mid-April. 2 degrees sounds like a small number. In tropical meteorology, it is the difference between a storm that struggles and a storm that thrives.
By the time Sinlaku was classified as a tropical storm, it was already moving on a track that the models agreed on with unusual consistency. It was going to Guam. There were wobbles in the projections, small uncertainties about exactly which part of the island would take the worst of the eye wall, but the general direction was never seriously in doubt after the first 3 days of tracking. What remained uncertain, and what became the central meteorological story of Sinlaku's approach, was how strong it would be when it arrived. Rapid intensification is one of the more frightening terms in the vocabulary of tropical meteorology. It refers to a specific rate of strengthening, defined technically as an increase of at least 30 knots in maximum sustained wind speed over a 24-hour period. But the definition understates how alarming the phenomenon can be when you watch it happen in real time. Sinlaku underwent rapid intensification not once but twice during its approach to Guam. The first episode occurred 3 days before landfall, pushing the storm from a moderate typhoon to a strong one overnight. The second episode began approximately 36 hours before the storm's eye made its closest approach to the island, and this one was more severe. Within a single overnight period, Sinlaku's maximum sustained winds increased by nearly 45 knots. By dawn on April 14th, the storm had reached Category 4 intensity on the Saffir-Simpson scale, with sustained winds of approximately 130 miles per hour and gusts that were being measured or estimated. Since actual measurement inside the eye wall of a major typhoon is not a straightforward exercise, at 160 miles per hour and above. The Saffir-Simpson scale is an American classification system that was designed for Atlantic hurricanes, and its application to Western Pacific typhoons is not always a clean translation, but the intensity categories are understood well enough to communicate the general character of a storm to a broad audience. A category for a storm is a major storm. It is the kind of storm that, if it hits a metropolitan area in the continental United States, generates wall-to-wall national news coverage and is remembered for decades. It is the kind of storm that engineers and emergency managers plan for when they are thinking about worst-case scenarios. And it was heading, with meteorological precision, toward a set of islands that are home to approximately 200,000 people, that have one major hospital, one major port, one power grid, and no road that leads anywhere except back to where you started. To understand what Sinlaku did to Guam and to the islands of the Northern Marianas, you have to understand what these places are. They are not abstractions on a map. They are communities that have been inhabited for thousands of years. Places where families have lived for generations. Where children go to school and parents go to work and old people sit on porches in the evening and watch the sun go down over the Philippine Sea. They are also, in a fact that is often glossed over in discussions of Pacific geopolitics, American territory. The people who live there are American citizens. They serve in the United States military at rates that are among the highest of any population in the country. They pay into federal programs. They fly the American flag. And they are in the specific and practical sense that matters most in a disaster. Completely isolated. The nearest significant American city is in Hawaii, roughly 3,800 miles to the east. The continental United States is nearly 6,000 miles away. When Sinlaku made landfall, the people of Guam were not going to receive help from neighboring states. There are no neighboring states. There are no mutual aid agreements with places that can be reached by truck. There is only the ocean, in every direction. And whatever preparations were made before the storm hit, because after the storm hit, resupply would come by air or by sea. And neither of those options operates on a timeline that addresses the immediate needs of 200,000 people who have just been through a category for typhoon. This is not a new problem. It is not a problem that emerged with Sinlaku. It is a structural feature of what it means to be an island community in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. And it is a feature that has shaped the disaster response history of Guam and the Northern Marianas in ways that are sometimes celebrated for their resilience and sometimes criticized for their inadequacy. What Sinlaku did was not create this vulnerability. It ribiled Italiano. It pressed on it with 130 miles per hour of sustained wind and somewhere between 15 and 20 inches of rain, and a storm surge that in the lowest lying coastal areas reached heights that engineers had discussed as theoretical maxims and that most people had assumed they would never actually see. The island of Guam is shaped roughly like a boot, narrow in the middle and wider at the north and south ends, running about 30 miles from tip to tip and averaging around 8 or 9 miles wide. At its widest point, nowhere on the island is more than 4 or 5 miles from the ocean. This is relevant because it means that there is no interior refuge in any meaningful sense. When the ocean begins to rise and the wind begins to push water inland, it pushes it toward other water. The island does not have the depth to absorb a major surge event the way a broad coastal plain might. What the island has instead is elevation, which varies considerably from the flat limestone plateau of the north to the volcanic hills of the south. And it is this topography that determined, in large part, who on the island experienced the storm as something survivable and who experienced it as something that came very close to being otherwise. The municipalities of the northern plateau took the storm surge hardest. These are relatively flat communities, some of them developed on reclaimed land or on low coastal terraces that sit only a few feet above mean sea level under normal conditions. When Sinlaku pushed the ocean ahead of itself, as it approached from the northwest, the surge arrived in these communities not as a dramatic wall of water of the kind that disaster films have made people imagine, but as a relentless, progressive inundation. Water rose through storm drains and drainage channels first, then through doorways, then through windows. It rose to knee height, and then waist height, and then higher in the places that were most exposed. And it carried with it the debris of everything it had already passed through, boards and furniture and vehicles, and the accumulated material of neighborhoods that had been standing. In some cases, since the island was rebuilt after the Second World War, the winds arrived before the surge reached its worst, and in some ways the wind was the less complicated part of the storm to describe, because the damage it caused was the most visible. A category for wind field does not discriminate between old construction and new construction in the way that building codes might suggest it should. It finds weaknesses. It finds the roof that was installed 12 years ago and never quite properly secured. It finds the window that was not properly shuttered. It finds the wall that was load-bearing in the design documents, but that had been subtly compromised by years of moisture and the small cracks that appear in concrete over time, and that are not always repaired because they do not seem serious until they are. The wind found all of these things in Guam over the course of the 8 to 10 hours that the storm's most intense winds were affecting the island. And when it was done, the landscape of damaged and destroyed structures that it left behind was a record of every decision that had been made about construction and maintenance and investment, compressed into a single brutal audit. The Guam Power Authority, which is responsible for the electrical grid that serves the entire island, had been monitoring Sinlaku's approach with a mixture of professional preparation and what its personnel would probably describe as a realistic fatalism. The grid had been damaged by previous typhoons. It had been rebuilt, upgraded, and in some areas completely replaced after Typhoon Mawar in 2023, which caused approximately $3 billion in damage to the island, and which left large portions of the population without power for weeks, and in some cases, months. The improvements made after Mawar were real. More transmission lines had been placed underground in the most vulnerable coastal areas. Substations had been hardened. The utility had invested in additional generation capacity that was designed to come online quickly after a major weather event. None of this made the grid invulnerable to a category for typhoon. The engineers who designed these improvements knew they were not creating invulnerability. They were creating resilience, which is a different thing, a better starting position from which to recover, a shorter path back to functionality, a system that could absorb more damage before it failed completely. But fail it did. Within 2 hours of the storm's peak, winds reaching the island's main population centers, the grid was down, not partially down, not degraded to a fraction of its capacity. Down. The interconnected nature of electrical transmission infrastructure means that when enough nodes in the system fail, the whole system goes. You cannot have half a grid the way you can have half a road. When the substations that serve the northern municipalities went offline under the combined assault of wind and flooding and debris impact, the cascading effect moved southward through the network with a speed that the utilities engineers, watching from the emergency operations center that had been hardened specifically for this kind of event, described afterward as happening faster than any of their models had predicted. The lights went out across Guam in stages, community by community, and then all at once in the south. And by the time the eye of Sinlaku was passing over the northern tip of the island, the entire electrical grid of a major United States territory had ceased to function. This is a sentence that is easy to read and very hard to fully understand. The electrical grid is not simply a convenience. It is not the difference between having your phone charged and not having your phone charged. The electrical grid is the foundation on which every other critical system rests. It powers the pumps that move water from the underground aquifer to the treatment plants and then to the taps where people fill their glasses and flush their toilets. It powers the refrigeration systems that keep medications viable and food safe. It powers the communications infrastructure, the cell towers and the cable systems and the internet connections that allow people to call for help and allow emergency managers to coordinate response and allow hospitals to communicate with each other and with the mainland. It powers the elevators in the buildings where some people, the elderly and the disabled and those who had not been able to evacuate to shelters, had sheltered in place. When the grid went down, all of these systems began a countdown. They had backup power, most of them. Hospitals have generators, cell towers have battery banks, the water treatment plants have emergency diesel systems. But backup power is designed to bridge a gap, to keep things running for hours or at most a few days, while the main power system is restored. In the wake of Sinlaku, the gap that needed to be bridged was not measured in hours. The conversation about Guam Memorial Hospital and what it went through during and after Sinlaku will probably continue for years, not because the hospital failed in any dramatic or scandalous way, but because the story of what its staff managed to do under conditions that no institution should have to face is the kind of story that takes a long time to fully understand. The hospital lost main power during the storm's peak, as expected. The backup generators came online as designed. The surgical suites remained functional. The emergency department, which had been preparing for mass casualties since the storm watch was issued 4 days earlier, was staffed beyond normal capacity, with personnel who had come in early and chosen to stay, who had eaten whatever food was available in the hospital cafeteria, and who had slept, when they slept, on cots in break rooms and unused offices. The patients who were already in the hospital when Sinlaku arrived presented one kind of challenge. The patients who began arriving after the storm's winds decreased enough to permit travel presented another. The post-storm emergency caseload was not dominated by the dramatic injuries that people associate with typhoon disasters. Not crush injuries from collapsed buildings, though there were some of those, and not drowning victims, though there were some of those too. The dominant injury pattern in the first 72 hours after slower, more complicated kind of harm that comes from a population dealing with damaged infrastructure over a sustained period. People with diabetes who could no longer refrigerate their insulin. People with cardiac conditions whose medications had been lost or destroyed. People who had been managing chronic wounds that had become infected in the humid, debris-filled environment of the post-storm days. Elderly residents who had been weakened by the stress and exertion and heat of sheltering in damaged homes, without air conditioning in a tropical climate. Children with respiratory conditions aggravated by the mold that begins to grow within 48 hours in warm, wet spaces. The hospital's generator fuel was the constraint that shaped every decision. The administration had been aggressive about pre-positioning fuel before the storm, stockpiling more than its standard reserves, and this decision proved to be one of the most important made in the entire pre-storm preparation period. But fuel burns at a rate that does not care about intentions or contingency plans. By the third day after landfall, the hospital was consuming its reserves faster than anyone had projected. Because the ambient temperature without functioning air conditioning in the main building was causing sensitive equipment to require more cooling assistance than designed, and because the emergency department was running at a throughput that the backup systems had not been sized to support indefinitely. The request for emergency fuel resupply went through. The Federal Emergency Management Agency's joint field office that had been established at Anderson Air Force Base before the storm, and the response that came back was what emergency managers describe in careful bureaucratic language as being subject to current logistics constraints, which meant that the military cargo aircraft that would normally have been tasked with this resupply were simultaneously being used to move search and rescue teams to communities in the northern part of the island that were inaccessible by road, to deliver emergency shelter materials to families whose homes had been destroyed, and to begin the initial assessment flights that were needed to determine the full scope of what Sinlaku had done to a place that was still, in large parts, completely cut off from the outside world. What that partial picture showed was bad, worse than the pre-storm assessments had projected based on the track and intensity of the storm. The discrepancy between the models and the reality was not a failure of the modeling. The models had done their job reasonably well in projecting the storm's track and its general intensity. The discrepancy came from factors that are genuinely difficult to incorporate into regional damage projections. The specific vulnerability of individual structures, the precise distribution of debris impacts, the way that surge and wind combined in particular locations to produce effects that neither factor alone would have produced, and the condition of infrastructure going into the storm that in some cases had been assessed as adequate, and that the storm's severity revealed to be less adequate than those assessments had suggested. The number that kept appearing in the early damage reports, the one that emergency managers and government officials kept returning to in their briefings, was the structural damage count in the first 72 hours. As assessors worked through the communities that were accessible, the count of structures that had been either destroyed or rendered uninhabitable kept rising. Not because there was new damage being discovered, but because the damage had been so widespread and so severe that it took time simply to look at all of it. By the end of the first week, the preliminary estimate was that more than 6,000 structures on Guam alone had suffered damage serious enough to require assessment before reoccupation, and of those, somewhere between 20 and 25% had sustained damage that the assessors were classifying as either destroyed or requiring major reconstruction before they could be safely inhabited. The federal response to Sinlaku began before the storm made landfall, which is standard procedure for a storm of this projected magnitude making landfall on American territory. FEMA had prepositioned supplies at Anderson Air Force Base and at Anderson and at the port facility at Apra Harbor, which is the main commercial port for Guam, and which is also used as a logistics hub for military operations throughout the Western Pacific. The prepositioning had been more extensive than 4 previous storms, in part because the lessons of Typhoon Mawar in 2023 had been absorbed into planning documents, and in part because the storms tracked toward Guam had been clear early enough to allow time for additional preparation. Water, food, medical supplies, shelter materials, generators, and fuel. All of these had been moved into position in the days before landfall. The difficulty was not with having the supplies. The difficulty was with distributing them after the storm. Distribution requires roads, and the roads were blocked. It requires coordination, and the communications infrastructure was degraded. It requires local knowledge of where people are and what they need, and that knowledge was still being gathered. The military, which has significant assets on Guam, and which was positioned to respond immediately, provided crucial capabilities in the first hours and days. Helicopters for aerial assessment and the delivery of emergency supplies to communities that could not be reached by road, engineering units for debris clearance on priority routes, medical personnel who could supplement the overwhelmed civilian healthcare system. But the scale of the need exceeded even the substantial assets that were available, and the process of matching resources to requirements was slower and more complicated than anyone had hoped it would be. The specific character of the Sinlaku response was shaped by a problem that is not unique to Guam but that is more acute there than almost anywhere else in American territory. The problem of scale and isolation in the continental United States. A disaster response that falls short of what is needed in one location can be supplied by resources from neighboring jurisdictions. If the State Emergency Management Agency in one state is overwhelmed, the compact arrangements that govern interstate mutual aid allow neighboring states to send personnel and equipment. If federal stockpiles in one regional warehouse are depleted, supplies can be trucked from other warehouses within hours. None of these mechanisms function across several thousand miles of Pacific Ocean. What arrives in Guam arrives by air or by sea, and the timeline for that arrival is measured in days under the best conditions, not hours. In the days immediately following Sinlaku, with Apra Harbor's channel partially obstructed by debris and with air traffic concentrated on the most urgent life-safety missions, the timeline was longer than the best conditions. The generator fuel situation became the central logistics challenge of the first 2 weeks. Every critical facility on the island, every hospital and emergency shelter and communications node and water treatment plant and government operations center, was running on diesel generators. They were all consuming fuel at rates that their backup systems had not been designed to sustain for extended periods, because those systems were designed to bridge outages measured in hours, not to serve as a primary power source for an indefinite period while an entire island's electrical grid was rebuilt. The calculations were straightforward and alarming at current consumption rates. Without resupply, the fuel reserves at most critical facilities would be depleted within 10 to 14 days of the storm. Some facilities had more reserve than others, but the average was uncomfortably close to the outer edge of the response timeline. The emergency fuel resupply operation that followed was one of the larger logistics challenges that FEMA and the Department of Defense had undertaken in the Pacific since the Second World War, which is not a comparison that people make lightly, and which gives some sense of the scale of what was being attempted. Military cargo aircraft flew resupply missions from Hawaii and from the continental United States, carrying fuel and generators and the full range of emergency supplies that an island of 200,000 people requires when it's normal. Supply chains have been disrupted. Ships were dispatched from the West Coast, loaded with the kinds of bulk supplies that cannot practically be moved by air, the lumber and roofing materials and construction equipment and heavy generators that are needed, not just for emergency response, but for the longer process of rebuilding. The Navy activated vessels from its Pacific Fleet to support the logistics operation, and the Coast Guard deployed assets for port assessment and channel clearing to allow commercial shipping to resume at Apra Harbor as quickly as possible. There is a dimension of what happened with Sinlaku that extends beyond the physical damage and the logistics of response, and it is a dimension that has been discussed in quieter settings than the official briefings and press conferences. In the conversations among emergency managers and policy researchers, and the people who study disaster governance for a living, it is the question of what it means that this happened, that a major American territory took a category for typhoon hit and found itself in the situation it was in, and whether the situation was, in any meaningful sense, avoidable. The honest answer to that question is complicated. The storm itself was not avoidable. Typhoons have been hitting Guam and the Northern Marianas for as long as there has been a Western Pacific, which is to say, forever. And the conditions in the Pacific that made Sinlaku as strong as it was reflect long-term changes in ocean temperature that are not reversible on any human policy timeline. What was potentially avoidable, or at least reducible, was the severity of the consequences. The building stock on Guam, which includes a significant proportion of structures that were built before current codes and that have not been retrofitted to current standards, performed worse in Sinlaku than modern engineering would predict for properly constructed buildings. The electrical grid, despite the improvements made after Mawar, still relies predominantly on overhead transmission lines in areas where underground placement would significantly increase resilience. The communications infrastructure, the single most critical enabler of post-disaster response, had been discussed in planning documents for years as a vulnerability that needed to be addressed with hardened and redundant systems, and those hardened systems had been partially but not fully implemented at the time Sinlaku arrived. These are not failures of the people who live on Guam, or who work for the agencies responsible for the island's infrastructure. They are the accumulated result of decades of funding decisions made in Washington, for a set of islands that do not have voting representation in Congress, that cannot deliver electoral votes to presidential candidates, and that are, in the political geography of American domestic policy, a long way from the center of attention. The infrastructure vulnerability of Guam is not a secret. It has been documented in report after report, identified in after-action reviews following every major and included in the budget requests that the government of Guam and the federal agencies that work there have submitted year after year. The gap between the documented need and the actual investment has been consistent and persistent, and it is a gap that Sinlaku made impossible to ignore, at least for a while. Whether the attention that Sinlaku brought to this gap will translate into the kind of sustained investment that actually closes it is a question that history gives limited reason for optimism about. The pattern of American disaster response, observed across decades and across many different kinds of disasters in many different places, is one of intense focus during the acute phase, substantial investment in the immediate recovery, and then a gradual return to something close to the previous equilibrium once the news cycle moves on and the political urgency fades. The specific and structural investments that would reduce vulnerability over the long term, the ones that require sustained budget commitments across multiple appropriation cycles, have a harder time competing against the immediate demands of whatever the next crisis is. Guam has been through this cycle before. Its residents know it well. The most experienced among them have seen it play out after Paka and after Pongsona and after Mau, and they approach the current moment with the particular form of practical hope that comes from having survived things before. Not naive optimism, but the knowledge that things do eventually get rebuilt, and that the work of rebuilding begins immediately, regardless of what Washington eventually decides. On the morning of April 20th, 5 days after Sinlaku's center passed over the northern part of Guam, a crew from the Guam Power Authority was working on a transmission line in the village of which sits in the northern plateau area, and which had been one of the hardest hit communities during the storm. The crew had been working since dawn, which at this time of year on Guam comes early, and by mid-morning they had managed to restore power to a small section of residential streets that had been dark since the storm. The moment the power came back on in those houses, some of which had been occupied continuously since before the storm by residents who had chosen to shelter in place rather than evacuate to public shelters, was not captured on video or documented in any official record. But it was described afterward by one of the linemen on the crew, who said that within about 30 seconds of the power coming back, people started coming outside. They came out of houses that had visible damage. Houses where the windows were boarded or the roofs had tarps on them. Houses where the front yards were still covered in debris. They stood on their damaged porches or at their broken doorways, and they watched the power come back on in their street lights and in their neighbors' windows. And some of them cheered, and some of them cried, and most of them did both. This is the part of a disaster story that gets left out of the briefings, and the damage assessments, and the logistics reports. The part about what it means to a human being to have a light turn on. The power in those few blocks of Didado represented approximately 0.003% of the island's total electrical load. It was a negligible fraction of what needed to be restored before Guam could be said to be on its way to recovery. But it was also a signal, visible and tangible and unmistakable, that the work of putting things back together had begun and was producing results. The power restoration timeline that Guam Power Authority published in the days following the storm projected that essential infrastructure, hospitals and emergency services and water treatment facilities, would have reliable power restored within 2 to 3 weeks of landfall. Non-essential residential and commercial customers, the term, the utility used for the rest of the population, were projected to have power restored within 60 to 90 days, with the most damaged and remote areas potentially taking longer. These projections were based on the assessment of damage to the grid that crews had been able to conduct in the first days after the storm, combined with estimates of the repair crews and equipment and materials that would be available given the logistics constraints of an island in the middle of the Pacific that had just taken a direct hit from a Category 4 typhoon. The projections were honest, and for many of the people who received them, they were also devastating. 60 to 90 days without power in a tropical climate is not simply an inconvenience. It is a sustained emergency. Food stored in refrigerators and freezers, spoiled within days. Air conditioning, which in the context of Guam in April is not a luxury but a medical necessity for the elderly and the very young and for people with certain health conditions, is impossible without electricity. The economic losses accumulate rapidly. Businesses cannot operate, employees cannot work. The normal functioning of a modern community, which depends on electricity in ways so fundamental that most people never think about them until the electricity is gone, simply stops. The small generator that a family manages to obtain, running on fuel that gets more expensive and harder to find with each passing day, becomes the center of daily life. People make decisions about what to plug into it based on a hierarchy of needs that most of them have never had to think about before. First, the medications that require refrigeration, tente fans. Then the device chargers. Because communication is how you know what is happening and how you reach people you are worried about. The light bulb, the most basic unit of modern electrical life, is almost a luxury in this context. You do not plug in lamps until you have taken care of the things that actually matter. And you lie awake at night, listening to the generator running outside, doing the mental arithmetic of fuel consumption and fuel cost, and how many more days you can keep this going before one or the other of those numbers becomes a problem you cannot solve. The question of what counts as recovery is one that the people of Guam have been living with in various forms since before tsunami, and it is a question that takes on new urgency in the weeks and months following a major storm. The official metrics of recovery are measurable: percentage of power restored, percentage of roads cleared, number of structures assessed and cleared for water pressure restored to baseline levels, communications infrastructure returned to pre-storm functionality. These numbers matter, and they are tracked carefully by the agencies responsible for the response, and they will eventually tell a story of a community that was severely damaged and that came back. But they do not capture everything that matters. What they do not capture is the human cost of the time between the storm and the full restoration of those metrics. The medical complications that accumulate in a population without reliable power and clean water for extended periods. The economic losses that fall disproportionately on families who do not have insurance or savings to cushion the gap between the storm and the recovery. The psychological toll of living in a damaged home or in an emergency shelter for weeks or months, of not knowing when things will return to something like normal, of watching the process of rebuilding move at a pace that the urgency of the need does not match. These costs are real, and they are substantial, and they are distributed unequally across the population in ways that reflect the unequal distribution of resources and vulnerability that existed before the storm. The people who were most vulnerable before tsunami, those with the least financial cushion, the oldest and least healthy, those in the most damaged housing, those without the social connections and institutional access that help people navigate complex disaster bureaucracies, are the people who are most likely to still be dealing with the consequences of the storm long after the official recovery metrics have reached acceptable levels. This is not a Guam-specific observation. It is one of the most consistent findings in the research literature on disaster recovery, documented across dozens of events in different countries and different contexts. Disasters do not create vulnerability. They reveal and deepen vulnerability that already exists, and recovery, as it is typically organized and funded and measured, tends to reach the most vulnerable last. Sinlaku is not, in the long view, an exceptional event. It is, in the long view, exactly what the Western Pacific has been producing for millions of years, a rotating system of organized convection, powered by warm ocean water and shaped by the Coriolis force, moving across the ocean until it encounters land and releases its accumulated energy. The science that explains why Sinlaku formed and why it strengthened as rapidly as it did and why the water temperatures that fed it were as warm as they were is not mysterious or contested. The physics of tropical cyclone formation and intensification is well understood. The relationship between sea surface temperatures and storm intensity is established and quantified. The reasons why the Pacific in April 2026 was warmer than historical averages in this region are the same reasons that the ocean has been warming generally over the course of the past several decades, and they are reasons that are not going away. This means that the conversation about what Sinlaku was and what it did has to be held simultaneously with a conversation about what comes next. Not necessarily in the immediate term, not necessarily the next named storm in the Western Pacific typhoon season, but in the broader sense of what the trend line of events like Sinlaku looks like over the coming decades for a set of islands that sit in the path of some of the most intense weather the planet is capable of generating. The people who live on Guam and the Northern Marianas did not choose to live in the path of typhoons, in the same way that people choose to live near fault lines or in floodplains. They live where their ancestors have lived for generations, where their communities and their histories and their families are. They are not going to leave. They are going to rebuild, as they have rebuilt before, and they are going to be vulnerable to the next storm, as they have been vulnerable to previous ones. The argument that this vulnerability is acceptable, that it is simply the price of living in a certain part of the world, has always been thin. It is thinner now. The combination of increasing storm intensity, driven by ocean warming, and the specific and documented infrastructure vulnerabilities of American territories in the Western Pacific creates a compounding problem that is not going to be solved by any single storm response, no matter how well executed. It requires sustained investment of a kind, and at a scale that American policy toward its Pacific territories has not historically provided. And it requires that investment to be made during the periods between storms, when the urgency is less visible and the political will is correspondingly harder to sustain. In the short term, on Guam in the weeks after Sinlaku, the work was what it always is after a major storm: clearing and assessing and repairing and rebuilding, moving from the most urgent to the less urgent, from the hospitals and the water systems and the power grid to the roads and the homes and the schools, piece by piece and day by day, with the particular combination of exhaustion and determination that characterizes communities that have been through this before, and know that it is survivable because they have survived it before. The lineman in Didado, who watched his neighbors come out of their damaged houses when the lights came back on, was not thinking about policy or investment cycles or the long-term trajectory of Pacific Sea surface temperatures. He was thinking about the next section of line and the crew that was meeting him there, and the list of communities that were still waiting. The recovery had begun. That was enough for that morning to keep going. The scale of what Sinlaku left behind will take months to fully document and years to fully address. The numbers that will eventually emerge from the damage assessments and the economic impact studies and the recovery program evaluations will be large, in the billions of dollars by any reasonable accounting, and they will be distributed across categories that range from the straightforwardly physical to the harder to quantify human costs that do not appear in budget documents. What those numbers will not fully convey is the experience of being on Guam or Tinian or Saipan in the days after Sinlaku. The smell of standing water and disturbed soil, the sound of generators, the sight of families picking through the debris of their homes, looking for the things that are worth, saving the weight of the uncertainty about how long this will last and how it will end, and whether the next storm will come before the damage from this one has been repaired. These things are not separate from the policy questions or the infrastructure questions or the investment questions. They are what those questions are about. They are what was at stake when the funding decisions were made or not made, when the infrastructure improvements were prioritized, or when the vulnerability was documented in a report that was filed and not acted on. The storm that arrived on April 15th was the product of an ocean and an atmosphere operating according to physics. The severity of its consequences was the product of decisions that human beings made over years and decades about how much to invest in the resilience of a community that deserved better. Both of those things are true at the same time, and both of them need to be part of the conversation about what happens next.
The morning after a typhoon always arrives the same way. There is no dramatic announcement, no gradual lightening of the sky that signals relief. The wind simply stops. Not slowly, not gently. It stops the way a door slams shut, leaving behind a silence so complete and so foreign that people who have been awake all night inside concrete shelters and reinforced rooms find themselves confused by it. For a few seconds, maybe longer, they do not move. They sit in the dark, and they listen to the silence, and they try to understand what it means. Then someone opens a door, and they see what Sinlaku left behind. On the island of Guam on the morning of April 15th, 2026, that door opened onto a landscape that had been restructured overnight. Roads that existed 12 hours earlier were gone, not flooded, not blocked by fallen trees, but physically erased under meters of debris and sediment and the kind of soil displacement that happens when water moves through a place at speeds no engineer ever designed for. Power lines that had served communities since the 1980s lay twisted across what used to be yards and parking lots and the edges of what used to be highways. The trees that were still standing, and there were not many, had been stripped of everything. No leaves, no small branches, just trunks and the largest limbs pointing in the same direction. All of them bent slightly east, all of them telling you exactly which direction the wind had come from. Buildings that had been constructed after previous typhoons, buildings.
By the time Sinlaku was classified as a tropical storm, it was already moving on a track that the models agreed on with unusual consistency. It was going to Guam. There were wobbles in the projections, small uncertainties about exactly which part of the island would take the worst of the eye wall, but the general direction was never seriously in doubt after the first 3 days of tracking. What remained uncertain, and what became the central meteorological story of Sinlaku's approach, was how strong it would be when it arrived. Rapid intensification is one of the more frightening terms in the vocabulary of tropical meteorology. It refers to a specific rate of strengthening, defined technically as an increase of at least 30 knots in maximum sustained wind speed over a 24-hour period. But the definition understates how alarming the phenomenon can be when you watch it happen in real time. Sinlaku underwent rapid intensification not once but twice during its approach to Guam. The first episode occurred 3 days before landfall, pushing the storm from a moderate typhoon to a strong one overnight. The second episode began approximately 36 hours before the storm's eye made its closest approach to the island. And this one was more severe. Within a single overnight period, Sinlaku's maximum sustained winds increased by nearly 45 knots. By dawn on April 14th, the storm had reached Category 4 intensity on the Saffir-Simpson scale, with sustained winds of approximately 130 miles per hour and gusts that were being measured or estimated. Since actual measurement inside the eye wall of a major typhoon is not a straightforward exercise. At 160 miles per hour and above, the Saffir-Simpson scale is an American classification system that was designed for Atlantic hurricanes, and its application to Western Pacific typhoons is not always a clean translation, but the intensity categories are understood well enough to communicate the general character of a storm to a broad audience. A category for a storm is a major storm. It is the kind of storm that, if it hits a metropolitan area in the continental United States, generates wall-to-wall national news coverage and is remembered for decades. It is the kind of storm that engineers and emergency managers plan for when they are thinking about worst-case scenarios. And it was heading. This is a sentence that is easy to read and very hard to fully understand. The electrical grid is not simply a convenience. It is not the difference between having your phone charged and not having your phone charged. The electrical grid is the foundation on which every other critical system rests. It powers the pumps that move water from the underground aquifer to the treatment plants and then to the taps where people fill their glasses and flush their toilets. It powers the refrigeration systems that keep medications viable and food safe. It powers the communications infrastructure, the cell towers and the cable systems and the internet connections that allow people to call for help and allow emergency managers to coordinate response and allow hospitals to communicate with each other and with the mainland. It powers the elevators in the buildings where some people, the elderly and the disabled and those who had not been able to evacuate to shelters, had sheltered in place. When the grid went down, all of these systems began a countdown. They had backup power, most of them. Hospitals have generators, cell towers have battery banks, the water treatment plants have emergency diesel systems. But backup power is designed to bridge a gap, to keep things running for hours or at most a few days, while the main power system is restored. In the wake of Sinlaku, the gap that needed to be bridged was not measured in hours. The conversation about Guam Memorial Hospital and what it went through during and after Sinlaku will probably continue for years, not because the hospital failed in any dramatic or scandalous way, but because the story of what its staff managed to do under conditions that no institution should have to face is the kind of story that takes a long time to fully understand. The hospital lost main power during the storm's peak, as expected. The backup generators came online as designed. The surgical suites remained functional. The emergency department, which had been preparing for mass casualties since the storm watch was issued 4 days earlier, was staffed beyond normal capacity, with personnel who had come in early and chosen to stay, who had eaten whatever